This is the open source report on the 7th or the 8th of September. It varies on which network we're on, or which platform I should say, but nonetheless we'll try to be a little bit more precise with these. Normally it would air on the 7th or the 6th. I'm sorry, make sure we get that right. But nonetheless, we are here, and we're trying to make these programs on a weekly basis. At one time we were about every 3 months or twice a year. So we have changed a number of things and become more timely because open source is becoming more important. The stable kernel is at 3.16.1. Release candidate 3 is at 3.17. And 3.17, many people will start looking at that release candidate. We plan to do that. Let me go into some things here, some preliminary things. We'll be talking about a new daemon called Stymie. It's one that is out, and it's become popular in some distributions, and we'll talk about those distributions and where it stands, and then you will hear from one of its propagandists, Leon. Let me make sure I get Leon's name correctly here. You have to keep looking for whom he is. His name is Leonard Poettering, I think is how he pronounces Poettering. Anyway, nonetheless, you will hear from him, and you will hear about Stymie. And we'll talk about the pros and cons, where the Slackware people stand with it or without it. And we'll have a little interesting discussion that is starting things in related to the kernel and where containers and other things. Leon will talk about that. Well, let me start this open here with a blog of all things in the Huffington Post. And the date on that, I always try to find dates. Too many days working around courtrooms. It's the 4th of September. This is by Vera Shah, I think. AFSHAR, his name. Nonetheless, the title of the article is 10 Reasons to Use Open Source, Software-Defined Networks. Let me just get to a working definition there. It's called an SDN, is an approach to computer networking that allows the system administrator to manage network services through abstractions of lower-level functionality. This is done by decoupling the system that makes the decisions about where the traffic is sent, the control panel, from the underlying system that forwards traffic to the select destination. The data plane, the inventors and vendors of these systems claim that they simplify the network itself. So we'll get back to his article here. He starts with open source software now has a permanent role in enterprise IT world. From the prognosticators at Gartner, they forecast open source technology will include, and incidentally, we moved our program from software to technology because the blurring of the two. In other words, software is there, but it's technology. It could be hardware. So perhaps that is a better place for the program than perhaps just on the software, because we do talk about software, hardware. And the Huffington Post is owned by AOL, and normally has political content, but there is more and more the divisions between technology, politics, etc. are coming closer and closer together. At the Boston Red Network, we have our political program, which we started out in 2008, just simply Boston Red. And then we started Numbers Man. Numbers Man is a economic forecasting using macro models primarily. We talk about the economy, where it is and where it will go, real-time forecasting methods, etc. And those are two of the programs, and this third one is a technical program, and then something we have called BR on the World, which has not been broadcasting as much as it should be, where we deal more with events throughout the world. There's been a historic thing in the U.S. If you look at the CNNs of the world, etc., the cable outfits, they spend very little time on events outside of North America, some in Europe, some in the Mideast, if it is covering the Israeli-Palestinian or Syria or something of that nature, but it's very light indeed. Anyway, back to where we are here. The level of some elements of open source, the fastest growing segment within open source software is what's called software developed networks, which is simplify network configuration and management and decoupling. The market is projected to surge to 360 million, from that to 3.52 billion in 2018. That's about 4 years from now. To understand more about open source SDNs and why it's growing so quickly, he spoke with Neil Jacques. He's executive director of Open Daylight. Neil works closely with developers and user communities to advance these SDNs and network function virtualization. A lot about virtualization. We talk a little bit about containers there. We'll get to that. The range of software companies participating in the Open Daylight accounts for 95% of the entire SDN market. I took a look, this is the author here, at some of the open source, ORSS, and consolidated all the resources that people used open source into the top 10 list. And we'll just go briefly over his top 10. We put this on our Facebook page, the Boston Red page, and the Cranston Software page. But nonetheless, the important source of data on this is the Future of Open Source survey that is by Michael J. Sharrock. Is a partner in Bridge Venture Partners, is a strong proponent of open source software. Shares his views on CXO Talk panel at the CIO magazine. Our old pal used to be the editor many years of CIO magazine, and now she does consulting work out there, Lundberg and Lundberg. Anyway, nonetheless, back to where we were. In Boston, the annual survey provides the annual survey, into current state of the open source industry and analysis of future trends. This year, 1,240 people are represented, vendors, etc. there. And let me just go over his 10 things and we'll move on. The best quality of code, 80% of open software users choose to do so based on quality, removing company boundaries and allowing developers to participate in debates, compromise, and we'll get into that in a minute here, with the new daemon and why it should not be included. I think it was talking about Debian, and it's in OpenStymie, it's in open source, it's in Red Hat, and in Fedora. It's actually in Fedora, which is the red on open source there. Rapid innovation, we've talked about it, in the agile approach, your ability to produce new products and services, and increasingly and grammatically to focus on what matters most. And it seems like we've looked at some of these before. Security, although security may have once been viewed as a weakness for open source, it's certainly not today. The 2014 Future of Open Source, the 8th annual survey, 72% say they specifically choose open source because of security. Community, big word now, big buzzword. It means the collective. When we come in here, we have the late Nelson Mandela talking about the concept of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a community, the community participating. He gives the example of the traveler. Open source has the power to build communities of people who believe in technology and are passionate about seeing them come to light. The many are smaller than the few. Anyone can participate regardless of an affiliation, adding to the collective brain trust that goes back to some generalized theory of knowledge. We talk about that, and we'll talk about it more specifically on how software is built. It was a very interesting paper written, and we've done this, at least parts of it, at conferences before. 50% of corporations contribute to open source. They do and they don't. 56% say they will increase their contributions, but they have no choice. That's part of the problem right there. The Linux Foundation Collaborative Trends Report 213, we went over that. Freedom, you're not beholden to any one vendor. That is the most common situation that people talk about, and users choose open source. 95% want open source in SDNs and network function virtualization. As NFV solutions, it represents to them the greatest choice, more functionality, interoperability, etc. That's kind of an interesting situation. We look at several of these types of situations in the cloud, the container type virtualization programs. OpenStack, Red Hat will tell you their particular version of Red Hat Enterprise is better for the OpenStack, and there are organizations that do nothing but OpenStack, and they are agnostic to vendor. That's one thing to look out for very, very carefully. And we've had this argument with Red Hat now 15 years on what should be done, what should not be done, how services are brokered. Traditionally, open source organizations made their money off of consulting and adapting their particular, at least the developers, to a coding need of an enterprise or a company, etc. And then, of course, you have companies that exclusively take an open source project and add some type of management GUIs, etc., to it, and come up with their own particular. We think of Hortonworks here and several others, Cadera, they're with some affiliates of the Apache project. Nonetheless, choices and adaptability, we covered that. Interoperability, de facto standards. Open source dovetails nicely with standards efforts, and there are more standards efforts that you get away from the proprietary types that have some standards that only they had. I can recall one time on the hardware side, Dell had proprietary hardware. You could not use a hard drive, and the same thing with Apple. Apple's still proprietary. Other than the Dell hard drive was made by some OEM, and many other things, boards, etc. Now they are becoming more interoperable. Their interoperability is there, and hardware standards are coming more and more open, and it's forcing organizations like Intel to open up the architecture of their main boards and other things, and this will become more and more. And this fellow talks about his company, Extreme Networks, firmly believes in the benefits of open source and has committed to Open Daylight. We'll put a link up to Open Daylight and many of these others out here. What's basically happening is there are all kinds of open source projects, projects that are almost open. An example there would be the Linux kernel that eventually evolved, I guess we'll say, into Android, which is open source to a certain extent, and parts of it is closed by Google. And that is a thing we have to watch out for there, and many of us talking head pundits